Hello, friends, and welcome to I Know I Belong When, an innovation, unbiased production where bold voices, curious stories, and authentic impact amplify, knowing you are invited, seen, heard, and needed. I am your host, Christopher Bylone, Principal Strategist at Innovation Unbiased. This is more than a conversation. It is a movement, a mirror, a megaphone, one where raw truth meets radical hope. Welcome back to the show. What happens when a culture builder shows up with a dancer's timing and a musician's sense of wonder? You get a leader who can read a room, move a room, and redesign the room so everyone knows they belong. Today's guest is Chris Courneen, Global Head of HR at MS International, a strategist with a big heart who moves values into velocity. With over 15 years of experience across HR, operations, and leadership, he has helped shape an award-winning workplace by blending innovation with intentional care. Because belonging is not a poster on a wall, it is how people feel when they are in the room. Before HR, Chris lived on stage, professional dancer, musician, and longtime dance teacher. So yes, he has been making people smile and occasionally making them disappear long before this meeting invite. And the through line, he mentors with generosity, leads with authenticity, and gives people the confidence to do the most human thing at work, be themselves. Two pieces of literature guide his lens on identity and truth. We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, reminding us that belonging happens when we stop performing for acceptance and start showing up for each other. With energy, humor, and real human connection, lace up your dancing shoes and wave your magic wand. We are not just going to waltz through this conversation, we are going to apply some abracadabra to achieve full belonging. Chris, welcome to I Know I Belong When.
Thank you. I'm excited. I feel like I'm going to have to brush up on a few of my old magic tricks just to be ready next time I see some of my friends.
Well, if I would have known this, I didn't know you were a magician before. I would have asked you to bring some magic tricks on the show and demonstrate them for people. But, hey.
It is funny because I actually, for many years, never left the house without something on me. Because at some point, someone would say, hey, I thought you, and then for years, even at work, I always carried something on me, and like every few months, something would come up. I've broken that habit, but it used to be a very regular part of my life.
Okay, well, building on that, so from being a dancer to being a magician to now being an HR leader, what are some of the lessons from the stage that show up in the way you lead today?
I am a big believer that in HR, but probably in leadership in general, you can learn a lot from a stage life, whether it's acting, dancing, whatever. I think part of what we do, right, wrong, or indifferent, is perform at work. And we wear different hats depending on the scenario or the venue we are in. But I think what I learned most from those experiences is a few things. One, how to communicate emotionally and how to leverage emotion. I think I also learned a sense of confidence, truthfully, in engaging with people and engaging with groups, which is a huge part of my job today. And I think lastly, there is an element of me that has never left, which is I'm a little loud, I'm a little crazy, I like to have fun. And I think that is an important part of our work life. I learned from a gentleman named Rich Davini, who used to be a Navy SEAL, used to help, I think, even rewrite how Navy SEALs select who goes to which SEAL team. And he talked about how to build a team. And one thing that sat with me, and I learned this through performing and was surprised to hear him describe the key thing that the SEALs were using to understand whether or not a team would perform well, is its ability to have humor on the team. And a team without humor is a team that would fail. And so I just remember hearing him talk about this and me going back to like creating a show with a dance company, or all of the things that are really hard and really painful, and all of the moments of humor that brought us together, and then reflecting on my work life and within teams and transformation and hard work, the moments of humor that either diffused something or, in HR, you learn to laugh at the crazy, because if not, you'll be in a corner crying. So, it was an important part.
That is very true. And given over this past year, we've had to do a lot of laughter, or we would just be crying in the corner.
That's right.
And those listening probably aren't surprised. Chris and I have had many conversations where we've just had to laugh at what was happening around us, just because we would pick up the phone and been like, can you believe what just happened?
Yeah.
Some of those conversations just happened earlier this week. So, but that is for the non-show.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, friend. So on this show, we talk about names. And you have shared that a few of the books that inspire you, We Wear the Mask and Invisible Man, shape your thinking. How do those works influence the way you approach identity and belonging at work?
These are complicated thoughts and feelings, both for myself and I think for, all of our employees. And so I'll start with names, because these are really interesting, particularly in my current organization. So I am the opposite of you. Everyone calls me Chris. And if you call me Christopher, I'll probably stop you in your tracks and be like, well, who are you talking to? Because that is the name my parents use when talking to me. And if they called me Chris, I would just ignore them. I'd be like, I don't know who you're talking to. That's not me. So I have this very weird thing with my own name in my family. And when I started at MSI, this is the first organization where and when I interviewed, walking down the hall from the front door to the office I was in, the conference room, I heard 5 languages being spoken as I walked down the hall. And as I got to know people more, I realized how incredibly difficult it was for me to pronounce some names, because the pronunciation, depending on where in the world this person was from, was new to me. And so names became really important way of me expressing to someone the value I have in them as a person, because I don't know how to pronounce your name and I want to do it right. And I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to make you say it 5 times so I can say it right. And I'm going to go out of my way to get it right. And I've always used that as a method to communicate the level of care I have for you as an individual, that how you expect to be addressed is how I want to address you. And quite honestly, separate from Invisible Man, which I'd love to talk about, I learned the importance of names as a manager in a warehouse. When I took over a department, it was a very tricky department earlier in my career, and I knew a number of people in that department already, but this was the veterans, the OGs, the top performers that were also tricky to manage. And there was a supervisor in that department who was reporting to me. I was the new manager, and he pulled me aside on day one. I love this man. He was probably half my height, much shorter than I am. I'm tall. I'm 6'3". And he's like, look at me. And we had a good relationship, but he was like militant. He's like, you will learn every name in this department by tomorrow. If you don't care enough about these people. And that was like his thing. It was like nonstop. You have 24 hours. I'm quizzing you tomorrow. And it was, kind of comical, but also he was dead serious. And I remember the next day, he's like, who's that? Who's that? And this is a department of, like, call it 50 people, that he knew the trick to getting this department to work for you is you had to know them, because they weren't going to open up to you. They weren't going to tell you things if you didn't know them. And you start by knowing their name.
Right.
And now take that back to, my reflections on something like Invisible Man. It's my favorite book. I think the greatest piece of American literature ever. And the narrator in that book is unnamed. You never know the narrator's name throughout the entire novel. And the novel was written based off of really a short story that Allison wrote, which was the prologue, which I think is maybe some of the most powerful 20 pages in American literature. And it is not lost on me that you never know the name of the person telling the story. And that metaphor is so powerful for, the ability to scream at the world to be seen and never be seen. And in the prologue, he sits there with, I don't remember the exact number, 1,300 light bulbs illuminating him in this basement, and yet nobody sees him or who he is.
Right.
And that sat with me when I first read it in high school. And I probably read that novel 6 or 7 times through college, through an acting class where that was my monologue. And I'll never forget the acting professor. I'd read this, like, at that point, probably 5 or 6 times. And I give my monologue. I had memorized this prologue. And he goes, you don't know this book at all. I'm like, what do you mean I don't know this book? I got this book inside and out. Because no, you don't. I can tell by how you are reciting it. You don't actually understand what's going on. Read it again, but read it this way. And don't forget, we don't know who this man is. Go read it again, come back in here tomorrow, perform it a second time, and tell me if it feels different. It was powerful, but this idea of names has been really interesting to me, both in relationship building and in the power and fear of being known or unknown.
Yeah, I think to your point, both of us, we come at our names very differently, right? I'm always Christopher, you're always Chris. I was just at a networking event this past week, and somebody who I got introduced to for the first time, at the end of the event, I was leaving and I left, and he ran out after me and said, I called you Chris to see if you would correct me. And I turned back to him and I'm like, I just assumed you weren't talking to me. Right? Even though I was the only Chris or Christopher there in my head, and I said it earlier in the evening, if you call me Chris, I assume you're not talking to me. And so I just, for whatever reason, my brain did not turn on that he was trying to get my attention because I did not hear Christopher and just kept walking. And I honestly didn't even hear him say Chris. But my reaction to him was, you called me Chris. I just assumed you weren't talking to me. My brain did not turn on that somebody was trying to get my attention. And so the power of names is really important. And so talk to me about going beyond just the surface level of names, right? Yes, names are important to create belonging, but how do you go beyond somebody's name to really embrace the intersectionality that they bring to life?
I think part of how that starts, at least for me, is the space, the environment, and the structure of the team. Looking for opportunities to leverage the different opinions, experiences, life experiences and work experiences in and outside of the company, but creating an environment that is not homogeneous is actually, I think, step one to that, because I have been personally in my life in environments where I was the outsider. In fact, most of my life I have been the outsider in whatever environment I was in, and the feeling of not belonging, which was a fairly constant feeling throughout my life, has informed greatly probably the importance of making people feel like they belong, because I want the value you bring to the team. And if you don't feel like you belong, it's hard for you to bring that value. Either you want to assimilate to the group, and so you intentionally close out certain things that I want from you because you are trying to assimilate, whether to an idea or a culture or whatever, or the opposite. You are just too afraid to bring your unique perspective. And so, I think part of that is in some way, shape, or form, I think through storytelling of my own and sharing with people parts of myself and my history at work that demonstrate a more human side than the role. And I think that also means being very explicit, whether it's about the current work or prior work or all those things, but in the moments where I can demonstrate my own humanity, my own failures, my own challenges, to try to build a bridge so that your challenge, your success, your failure might be different than mine. But the fact that I'm willing to share it might mean you're willing to open up with your own, and therefore not be so afraid to speak up, not be so afraid to have a different opinion in the room. And when I was new, I remember very explicitly in our first gathering with our whole team, saying, I want to tell you a story about myself. And I spent 10 minutes talking about my learning disabilities and how difficult it was for me to read growing up, and why I can't speak a second language, unlike most of my team. And, the time I almost quit my job because I hated my boss, and all of the mistakes that I made that got me to where I am, because I wanted people to view me as a person not much unlike themselves, and not view me as this role that, honestly, I know I'm kind of the scary guy in the room sometimes. The most senior person in HR is...
You're not all that scary. I mean...
once you know me, I'm not, but the title is scary to some people. And so I want you to know me, not my title.
Right. No, that's very true, right? I mean, it's like being called to the principal's office.
A little.
Right? And so it's like, you never want to be like, hear your name and being like, oh, I got to go meet with the VP of HR. And you're like, what is happening today? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So humanize us, right? And all the leaders need to be humanized, because I think sometimes we forget that even though these very influential, powerful CEOs or executive leaders, they're still human, right? They still have feelings. They bleed like we do. They have children. They have relationships. They've made mistakes. They're just human, just like
Yeah.
each of us. And so if we can humanize everyone and get people to understand that there's a lot more that unites us than divides us, we're going to be able to have a lot more conversations and get a lot more stuff done to reach our goals, not just at work, but as a society.
Well, and I think take that down to the team level. We use this metaphor. I learned it from the founder of MSI. He said it over and over and over again. I thought it was so powerful. As you build a team, everyone plays a role on that team. Everyone brings a strength. Everyone has a weakness. And he uses the metaphor of the hand. And he said, you ask people, what's the most powerful part of your hand? If I were going to tell you to cut off a finger, what finger would you cut off? And inevitably, someone goes, all right, my pinky. And he goes, all right, tape your pinky to your hand. I want you to go through a day not using your pinky. And then tell me how difficult that day was for you. It's the weakest part of your hand that is most dependent on everything else. And yet it becomes incredibly difficult for you to operate a normal day without that pinky, and think of your team in that way. I don't care if you think someone is weaker than someone else. They are necessary. I don't care if you think someone's background didn't prepare them the way yours did. They are necessary. And if you are the pinky, you are still necessary on this team and valuable to the team. And so I think part of that is also helping people understand the value of everybody on the team. It is not just your top performers or the strongest ones or your best speakers or your smartest people in the room. It is the team together that can accomplish what needs to be accomplished. And even without what you might perceive as the weakest opinion in the room, the team suffers. Everybody has value. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, everybody brings value. It's all about what are their strengths and what do they bring to the team. Okay, so I want to shift the conversation just a little bit. And so I want to talk about Chris, and I want to talk about the moment that you knew you belonged somewhere. What was happening around you? What was the audience like? What were you experiencing in that moment when you got to say, I know I belong here?
I can think of two very distinct moments where I felt that way. I'm going to ignore my family because it's easy to use my family example. So I'll give you one work and one non-work related. And the work related one is probably during COVID, actually. So I had made the decision to leave a company I was with for 12 years that I loved, I still love, I have tremendous admiration and respect for. And that was probably the hardest decision I've ever made in my life, to leave that company to come where I am today. There's a lot of risk involved. There's a lot of unknown. I joined this company, call it 6-ish months later, COVID happens. And I remember the day the governor of California got on TV and basically said, we're shutting the state down. And I called the CEO and said, hey, we got a problem. Where are you? It was probably 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night. It's a long story. I was staying in a hotel because my home was under construction. I'm sitting very close to the office. I call him. He's like, I'm on the way home. And I said, okay, here's what I just heard the governor say. I'm coming back to the office if you want to meet me. I think we need to come up with a plan. And oh, by the way, I'm going to just start taking computers. I think we need to take some computers home. He turns around. We meet at the office. We were probably there later than I care to admit, but it was probably after 9 p.m. when we pieced together a lot of things, and that, no, we were actually going to be able to operate tomorrow. And as we were leaving, this person who I had only known for 6 months, as we're walking in the parking lot, was like, I could not have, thank you. I don't think I could have done tonight without your help. And from that moment through the next probably 3 months, the hub of our operational plan, how do we operate? How do we stay open? We were an essential employer. How do we keep people safe? The number of people who very clearly demonstrated to me a level of trust and needing the help, and the number of people who said, oh my gosh, you are through and through the person who is supposed to be here right now. I remember sitting there going, oh my gosh, this is not only the place I needed to be at the time I needed to be here, but I felt like the leaders believed that too. And I felt like part of a team that I was incredibly new to, that many of these people I hadn't met in person. We operate globally. I hadn't met all of these people. And I
Right.
remember the feeling I had of belonging that felt different than I had felt in many other instances in my life. And the only other time I remember really feeling that was when I was on stage performing. And I could get the feedback from an audience where I felt like I am doing what I should be doing. And that felt great. And I remember that feeling and saying, oh my goodness, like clearly I belong at this company, and I am not just this outsider sitting here. I am part of this company. But the way that made me feel harkened back to how I felt at periods of my life performing, where I felt like I belonged on a stage. And not because I was performing at MSI, but because of that internal, intrinsic feeling of, oh, this is the right thing for me. I felt that. And so that was pretty powerful, moment for me.
That's a really great one, and talk about being at an organization so early on in your role and then the world shutting down and being tested, not just in your leadership, but in the relationships that you had created and were continuing to evolve over time. So nothing like diving in feet first with no life preserver. Right.
And then having, to your point, the relationships where it would have been easy for people to fight me. It would have been easy for people to kind of put up walls, and I did not feel that, and I felt the opposite of that, and that was very powerful.
Oh, that's great. That's really great. And so you alluded to this a couple times already in the conversation about feeling like an outsider, and so we got to dive into it a little bit. So when were those moments that you did feel like an outsider, and how did you navigate those times when you know you didn't belong, so that you could find a sense of belonging?
It's interesting. We'll start, I went to school in Southern Arizona growing up before college, 60 miles from the Mexican border. When you look the way I look in Southern Arizona, the assumption is I was Mexican, which I am not. Most of my friends were Mexican. I can fake an accent, but I couldn't actually speak the language. And if I look at my family, my mother is half Black and half Japanese. My father is half English, half Irish. We are very close to my mother's side of the family. I know them much better than I know my father's side of the family. And the stories, my mother and father were performers. They were traveling and performing together. Had the Ku Klux Klan threaten to blow up, a radio station that they were in. They've been chased by people with Confederate flags in the South because who's this white guy walking with this black girl with a big Angela Davis afro? And my identity in a young developmental age was I didn't quite fit in with the folks that I was around. I wasn't, white enough to hang out with the white kids when, back in when I was in school, in particular the city I was in, they still fairly segregated at that point. Not by rule, not by law, but like the cliques that formed. I remember trying to be I was part of the Black Student Association, I think it was called, or the Black Student Alliance or something like that. And everyone was like, why is the Mexican dude in the Black club? And I remember distinctly not ever feeling like I fit in. I wasn't the social person. I didn't go party. I didn't hang out with people outside of work. I had moments where in basketball, which is what I played growing up, or in martial arts, which is what I did, I felt like I belonged in those groups. When I got hurt and I could no longer do those things, I lost the parts of me where I felt like I actually belonged to something. And I felt like an outsider through nearly all of my high school career. And in many ways, through parts of my college career, though, I think I benefited greatly from the fact that I was at a residential college, developed a group of friends that I became very close with. But I just remember never feeling like I quite fit in, even in college. A lot of my friends were Black, and I was the guy who wasn't, that people were like, who's that guy hanging out with all those people? And I had people ask these questions. And I just remember like the racial part of my identity always seemed to be in question by other people, not me. because it was what was more visible, I think, to people.
Right.
And even then in college, I didn't drink. I'm still not a drinker. It's like, I'm not going to go partying and get wasted with you. That made some people uncomfortable. I'm the sober guy that remembers everything you're doing. So I always had this weird outsider feeling kind of growing up, which I think informs two things about me. One, the moments where I feel like I belong are cherished. Two, I want other people to consistently feel like they belong, because I have the very real experience of not feeling like I belonged in many social settings and always felt like I belonged within my family. And so I think that changes many things about my relationships with folks, but also how impactful I know it can be when you feel like you don't belong. And then I said the last one is, and this is the truth, I call myself a paid extrovert. I'm an extrovert for a living. When I'm not working, I am very much so an introvert. I actually am very fine by myself. I am very fine. And this is how I got into magic. You know, when you ain't hanging out with a lot of friends, you learn to do weird things, like make stuff disappear, and you've got enough time to practice. So, you know, I was always more introverted than people realize, and incredibly uncomfortable in a lot of social settings. And I think that has probably also informed why making people feel like they belong is so important, because I am naturally a shy person that does not enjoy social groups. And I
would have never have guessed that.
You know, and even through my, like when I met you and others, it was so uncomfortable for me until a few years ago to just network with people. I'd never done it. Until a few years ago, I did not have a good, strong social network in the work environment. I didn't have a good, strong professional network. I made a decision that I needed to build that network because it would help me and I would learn something from it. But it was a conscious decision. Until only a few years ago, I would have never said hello to anybody at a conference. I used to go to conferences, I'd do the thing, I'd go back to my room, and then I would log in and work. And that was my life.
Well, that's how we met. We met standing on the sidelines watching whatever performer was happening at the moment at the SHRM National Conference.
Yeah.
In Chicago.
And 2 years prior to that, maybe even a year prior to that, I would have never even been there at a social setting to have that interaction. And so that feeling, I think, resulted in intentional behavior change on my behalf to try to expand a network that I knew would be valuable.
Well, thank you, because I would have never have met you then and wouldn't have had another friend. So this is awesome, right? My extrovert self, right? You know, it's like, how many friends can I have? So thank you for stepping outside of your comfort zone. I really appreciate that. So let's start to bring this home a little. So you and I are both data guys. We live in the center of return on investment and how are we going to continue to make improvements. So when we talk about sustaining belonging, talk to me about how you are going to ensure that the action you take are good returns on investments so that everybody knows that they belong in your organization.
Yeah, you know, I think the role of someone in an HR organization, whether they are in a role focused on belonging, focused on talent, focused on learning, whatever it is to be good at taking and identifying quantifiable data, and then how to take qualitative data and find ways to quantify it so that we can describe for people value in a way that is translated for the business to understand, not force the business to understand our language. And so for me, two things are true. One, if I can't describe a way to measure it, and I don't mean it has to be quantitative, it might be qualitative, but if I can't describe how to measure it, I'm not done coming up with the idea. Every idea needs to be measurable in some way, shape, or form.
Yes.
If it is qualitative, I need to figure out how to identify patterns in that data or convert, bucketize, whatever, that data so that I can begin to quantify it to tell a story, or use that qualitative data or those anecdotes to support some element of quantitative data, because I do believe storytelling is so important. I think it's probably central to what we do. You use data to tell stories. And so it always comes back to, how am I telling the story? Whether it's the story of the ROI or it's the story of change or whatever it is, I need both. I need the quantitative and the qualitative, because sometimes that qualitative data or those anecdotes are where the emotional connections live. And if I can leverage the quantifiable data that the business wants to speak, tie that with the emotional pull of qualitative data, and butt those two things together, that is the power of HR. We are uniquely positioned to marry these two things together to tell stories that improve our business. And so for me, it all comes down to storytelling and your ability to tell stories with data. It is not that everything has to be quantitative, but I should be able to either marry the two or identify trends in qualitative data that I can then quantify. And then lastly, I need to be able to connect it to something that is important in the business. If you do not understand the business, you don't understand how you make money, you don't understand how you operate. If you don't understand those things and you're running around telling stories about data that don't mean anything to anyone, no one's going to listen. So then the last step is I have to connect it to the mission, vision, values, purpose of the organization. I got to connect it to the strategy and the goals that we have identified to meet those strategies. And I view my role as a senior leader to constantly help the team navigate those things. How are we measuring? How are we telling stories with that data? And how am I connecting that to the stories the business cares about hearing? And if I'm trying to change something, transform something, okay, great. That story has to connect to something that is important to the business. And I think if that to me is really, a big chunk of the job, and is the power that we have as an organization that is really good at identifying and marrying that qualitative, emotional data with the quantitative data that the business speaks.
Yeah, I think business acumen for HR leaders, or just people leaders in general, if you don't understand the business that you are in and what you are trying to achieve, what are you doing? Right?
It's easy to tie some of these things. Belonging is incredibly important. Go look at your engagement survey data or your employee sentiment. Now go find the patterns and what happens when people feel like they don't belong. Shocker, they leave. Okay, well, can I quantify the cost of attrition? I sure can. Okay, so now I can start to quantify the benefit in dollars for increasing a sense of belonging, and then in productivity by improved engagement. I can turn these into things that the business cares tremendously about to sell an idea. And then we have to be accountability for us. We got to hold ourselves accountable. If I say that this initiative should achieve this outcome and I am measuring it and I'm not achieving the outcome, I'm either executing poorly or maybe I was wrong. My hypothesis was off. I got to go back and readdress that. But there is an element of accountability that's layered in all this where sometimes I'm going to be wrong. Sometimes the initiative isn't going to work. And I need to be able to describe to the business, did we not execute this right? Or was the hypothesis wrong? And I think that accountability is important because then it shows the business we're not sitting here living in thoughts, dreams, and hope. I am doing real work.
Right. Yes, leaders, human resources people are real leaders. We are actually doing real work. We are not just an expense. We are an investment into your organization. So just remember that when you're looking at our budgets.
Yeah.
Okay. I have one more question for you, because I view you as somebody who is a visionary and as somebody who lives in kind of the next practice of our profession. So from your vantage point, what is the next frontier for HR as we are connecting belonging to business outcomes?
I'll start with maybe something that's very tangible and something we're wrestling with today. How you measure sentiment, engagement, belonging. That's something that HR organizations have struggled and wrestled with. And I will tell you, I am a believer. I think we are on the horizon of this, although maybe it's not perfect today. On two big things. One, I have thought a lot about anonymous versus confidential data, particularly around employee engagement, employee sentiment, and how we measure those things. I used to be a big believer in anonymous data. I want you to feel safe and secure and sharing your real opinion, all of that. The problem is with anonymity comes a really interesting challenge. That is today, the technology that we are sitting on top of would allow me to leverage not just that data point, but everything I know about you from a people master data perspective within our organization, your goals, your feedback, your comp, everything about you to help me engage in what is true predictive analytics. That I think there's a lot of vaporware I've seen. We're not quite there yet, but we are so close. But to really do that, we need to build enough trust within the organization to say this is going to be confidential data, but not anonymous. I kind of need to know what you as an individual thinks from a data perspective, so I can tie all other things I know about you from a data perspective to identify problems before they start. Whether it's predictive analytics around like an attrition score. We talked about attrition earlier and who is more likely to leave and why. But take that down to who is on the verge of disengagement. Take that down to who may not feel like they belong and all of the warning signs that exist in the data. So if I think about, our future in that way, particularly around belonging, the ability to shift the organization from an anonymous to a confidential, trusted, I'll call it survey because I don't have a better word, and then leverage those data points with all of the other elements of our people master data in a huge data lake and apply these advanced algorithms, I might be able to start solving problems before they're so big that I'm triaging them. To do that, there's an insane amount of trust that you have to build across your employee base in your organization. There is an insane amount of honesty that becomes necessary within that organization about what we care about, what we don't care about, what we value, what we don't value, what we're going to work on, what we're not going to work on. And so that to me is a cultural thing rooted in my strong belief that our future as leaders, particularly as it relates to things around belonging, is going to be driven even more by data than it is by policy, because the data will help me move the needle on culture. It'll tell me where to focus. It'll tell me where we're struggling, and then let me put my attention on improving our culture there more than creating a blunt force object like a policy, which is not a bad tool, but it's a little bit more of a blunt force object trying to apply something to fix either problems I can see or perceive. Whereas if I can get the more surgical approach to identify areas of culture where I've got a gash and maybe I need a Band-Aid because it's a scratch now, and if I let it go, it's going to become a deep wound that needs stitches, or I might have to amputate. I don't want to get to amputate. I don't even want to get to stitches. I'm trying to fix it at the Band-Aid level, and data will drive me and my focus.
Well, I think also the data also is going to help us understand who's doing a good job, right?
Absolutely.
We talk always about trying to make sure like the attrition and who doesn't feel like they belong. Well, let's flip it. Let's use the data and say, what team has high sense of belonging? What team has low attrition? And what are they doing right? So that we can take and amplify that across the business and not always talk about who's doing the bad stuff, but talk about who's performing really well and put them on a pedestal and say, be like them. When we need the data to be able to understand who's doing a good job in our organization so we can give them the credit and say, be like this person.
Or make some decisions about leadership. If I can use this angle and say, oh, by the way, there is a correlation between business outcomes and this number. And now let's not just look at business outcomes, but let's look at who has these two things more tightly correlated, because that might be an even more successful leader. All of those things, I think the future use of data to gain insights that are harder to see today, not impossible, but harder, and to get to a world of predictive analytics that doesn't quite exist today, at least not at mass availability, I think is really where a lot of this future work will live, because it will allow us to leverage those insights to get the business outcome we want faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, Chris, this has been a great conversation. So to wrap this up, please finish the sentence. I know I belong when?
I don't have to wear a mask.
You don't have to wear a mask. You can just be Chris 100% of the time.
All the crazy.
I'm here for it. I'm here for it 100% of the time. Well, friend, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure and a great reminder that belonging is not a destination. It is a practice, and it starts with listening. So, friends, if this episode challenged you to move outside of your comfort zone, please give our show a follow, give us that 5-star review you know you want to give, and add a comment about what you will do to champion belonging today. These actions will help amplify the message to others, and we want to hear from you. Finish your own sentence of I know I belong when and send us a voice note. Your story could open a future episode. Thank you for listening. Know that your bold, authentic self is welcomed, valued, and loved. And until next time, remember, you belong here.